Today I'll get into mostly and just kind of talk about some background of industrialization, how, countries like mostly Britain, I think, were the first to really industrialize. And then, of course, it spread to other countries in the world, like the United States and Europe, and even spreading to Asia and all that. So I'll kind of get into that. So anyway, like I said, I'm going to move on to, of course, get into and talk about the Industrial Revolution today. I guess I'll first kind of talk about the background of the Industrial Revolution. By the way, if you want to join me at StreamYard.com, there it is right there. Of course, the link below. So, yeah, what was the Industrial Revolution? It wasn't really like revolutions we think of, like a political revolution. It was more this economic, social revolution that took place not just in Europe, but throughout the whole entire world. But it starts really back in the 18th century. 19th century is really when it really took off, all over the world, more or less. But basically, it's a deal where, primarily you get this deal where it's began there. And you have a case where, you've got these economies that begin transforming from what was like hand production, where they made everything by hand. And, the next thing they're making everything commercial, manufacturing. It kind of blows up. And part of why all that happened, by the way, which we'll, of course, see later, was that you get these population booms, of course, that occur throughout the United States, in Europe, in other countries, throughout the world. And so you have deals where you get this transition from like them moving to like machines. They're using machines. So you can see that picture right there. They're using machines in the background and all that. But machines, inventions, chemicals being used for various things, iron, steel production, steam power. Then they have water power, both those being used. Then electrical power, you got that being used. All kinds of new kind of machine tools are being used, of course, as well. Factories and other things, of course, are also coming along as well. And you get all these other things I'll kind of put on the screen too that are kind of things that, they also did as well. So you got, new steel making process. I'll kind of talk later about the so-called Bessemer process, which was invented like in the 1850s, is a good example. Mass production of all goods, assembly lines, like Henry Ford using assembly lines, built Model Ts, electrical grid systems being built everywhere, large-scale manufacturing of machine tools. And of course, you see there also, increase, advance in machinery, all kinds of new kinds of machinery that are coming along, which you can see, of course, in that picture right there. Also, extreme industrial growth. One thing about it, it's going to eventually lead to population booms, like in cities, and pretty much where they have all these factories or industries that they have are mostly in cities, like most of them are anyway. And the Industrial Revolution is usually divided into two sub-periods. They basically have the so-called First Industrial Revolution, and then they have what they call the Second Industrial Revolution. The dates are kind of vary. It's kind of, you can look up all kinds of dates, like when they start and all that. I know the Industrial Revolution in Britain probably started close to about 1740, 1750, in that range, they think. But it kind of goes back to close to 1700, they do think, probably starting out when Britain starts kind of developing like the coal industry and stuff like that. And the second one, it's debated like when it starts, somewhere close to 1840, 1850, in that range. That includes like other countries and stuff in the world. Like most of Western Europe, I know, starts to industrialize. Like under Emperor Napoleon III's Second Empire, Second French Empire, they started industrializing. As an example, Germany later industrializes in Europe to United States. It spreads like Asia. I think Japan was one of the first countries that really will start to industrialize. But basically, yeah, I'm going to get into today and talk about Britain, because Britain's really the first state that really starts to industrialize. They kind of come along, and starting in the 1700s, you get Britain starting to kind of, their empire starts kind of, being the workshop of the world, I think as Napoleon said, or something like that. And you get these urbanized centers. You get Manchester. They say Manchester was the first urbanized, industrialized city in the world that you had. Yeah, that's where it began. Also London as well, Birmingham, Glasgow. Some of those are England, Scotland, of course. Glasgow's in Scotland. So all those are areas that basically you start seeing this. And so that's one thing about, like I said, about, industrial growth. It leads to mass urbanization, throughout the world. There's a lot of causes or influences on why industrialization started. You can see in that list there, you've got, the enclosure movement is one thing they sometimes talk about as being kind of a reason why industrialization got started. Apparently, there was a deal where in England in modern times, so-called open field system ended, which went back to medieval times. Where they'd have some fields that would lay fallow, if you know about that. They might have 3 fields and there'd be like a third field that laid fallow. But in this case, they couldn't do that anymore because you have so many people, such mass urbanization, and growth, population. They got to grow as much crops as they can to feed everybody. And so they started enclosing all the land into larger tracts. And so it led to these large farms that kind of came about afterwards. And so it eventually led to various more modernized agricultural practices, which cut down on labor costs, production costs, and things like that. And they think that over time, what happened was because of the fact that they didn't need as many workers to work on farms or for cattle, whatever, they were employed in the industrialized cities. That's where they got the workers from. And so farm jobs declined, and of course, jobs increased in the cities. And so they think that's part of what led to the whole, industrial revolution beginning with that going on. That led into something number 2 there you see in the list, the British Agricultural Revolution, which they think peaked about 18th, 19th centuries would be the main period, which is considered a major cause, why the Industrial Revolution happened. So they start getting all these new advancements in farming that change. It becomes more scientific, farming, how they do it, and all that. And you can see they have, I'll kind of put them on the screen here, but they had all kinds of things they started doing that are kind of different. They started, mechanized equipment being used instead of people going out by hand and doing everything like growing crops, like trying to plant seed by hand and things like that. They start going away from that. Using fertilizers like chemicals and things like that are being used. Selective breeding of cattle takes off too about that time. New kind of crop rotation systems are coming in as well. So you got all kinds of different new techniques that are being used on agriculture, and that's what leads eventually into that, of course, occurring. So those kind of things, are some things that kind of occur that really do that. Also, they talk about inventions that were kind of big. Like really at England, one of the first big inventions that comes out is the so-called seed drill you may have heard about, which was invented close to about 1701. And the seed drill was invented by this English farmer named Jethro Tull. You probably heard of the rock group, right? It has like a flute in their songs. It's pretty good, actually. Their music, you listen to it like in the 70s and all that. But that's where they got the name from. It was named after the actual farmer, who I guess was the guy that kind of helped start the whole Industrial Revolution in England with this invention. And you can see, I guess you could push it, or you could have, horses or whatever, draw it, I guess. So yeah, he created that, which of course is well known. And then they say he invented the so-called horse-drawn hoe as well, which I guess must have been part of that as well. That was also big. So yeah, that's the so-called Jethro Tull seed drill that, of course, really started the whole, like I said, Industrial Revolution with with farming, changing that. Also, they have this other thing called the it's called different names, but it's the so-called Norfolk 4-course system, which was a type of crop rotation system that used it rotated nitrogen-rich plants or crops, which would be rotated with other kind of crops to replenish the soil, which would lose its nutrients when they grow crops. And so they came up with this idea to plant things like turnips and clover, which would mostly be used to feed cattle, which you can see. And so, yeah, you'd have these two main fields here where you would have, the wheat and the barley right here. And you got your turnips or your clover or even ryegrass would be used, which would feed the cattle, sheep, and all that. And I guess the manure, basically from the cattle would help to restore the soil, is what it would do. So it was invented really back in the 1600s, and it was invented by this man named, I don't think I've got his name up there, but his name is, they call him Turnip Townsend, or Charles Townsend. That's his name, but everybody called him Turnip Townsend. I think his name is, you want to go back up here, but it's listed right here, Charles Townsend. He invented that new kind of crop rotation system, which used 4 fields instead of 3 fields. They called him Turnip, though, because of the fact that he was kind of obsessed with using turnips and trying to get everybody to grow turnips. I think he was a gardener or something like that. It influenced farmers in general. So, yeah, that's what they would do. They would rotate it, where basically you have 1 field barley, turnips, wheat, clover, and then you just rotate it, every year that you would do that. They use other things too, like I think peanuts and other kinds of crops I think are used today, to kind of rotate crop rotation and things like that also as well. So those are things that were kind of famous, during that period. Also, other famous inventors I did want to mention about that were big with farming. It's pretty important. You heard of probably John Deere, right? John Deere, of course, everybody's heard of that. Deere Company. John Deere makes now tractors and other stuff like that. But John Deere in the 1800s was one of the first to mass produce farming equipment for people, especially in America. He developed some of the first cast steel plows that would come out eventually. I think they're iron actually first, and then became steel. That's what it is actually. So he's kind of important, John Deere. And then Cyrus McCormick was another one I think they talk about sometimes as kind of being important with farming equipment. He had his company called International Harvester Company up in Chicago. They basically were the first to mass produce like mechanical reapers to like cut grain, and things like that. And their tractors they have tractors later, which I think were red. I think the one for John Deere is green, the different colors that they use, of course, for their tractors. So those are things, of course, that were used. Fertilizers, they, of course, start doing that. There was a guy named Robert Bakewell. I'll talk about him, too. He was important, too, with some things they did with agriculture as well. But, yeah, fertilizers start to be used first. Manure at first, and then they start using phosphates and other chemicals to kind of, grow crops faster like that. So they start doing that. That mostly takes off in the 1800s when chemicals really start being used as fertilizers rather than, say, manure, that kind of thing, which was mostly what they used going back to medieval times. And then selective breeding, like I said, Robert Bakewell was one of the first to really do that in England. He started, crossbreeding, I think mostly sheep, and then eventually that led to basically other people wanting to do the same thing, and it led to a cattle boom in England, especially with sheep. And so the raising of sheep was a big thing because of the wool industry. There's a joke that sheep ate men because it ate their livelihood. And so, it doesn't take a whole lot of men to tend sheep, does it? If you think about that. And so, yeah, a lot of people had to go find work in the cities because there's just not enough farm work, things like that. Other things, of course, that happens too. If you go down, of course, number 3, like I said, urbanization, industrialization of the cities. That's something that kind of starts, like I said, in a lot of these cities, more or less. Some of these cities start to be pretty big. I'll kind of give you some ideas of some of these cities, but like I was talking about Manchester, which, back in the 17th century, Manchester had 6,000 people. In England in 1685, by 1880s, like getting close to 1900, it was getting close to 400,000, just to give you an idea. Liverpool, 1680s, about 4,000 people population-wise. By 1880s, almost 600,000 range. London, of course, that's of course the best one example to give. In London, 1800, they had a population of 1 million people. 1850, 2.3 million. And then by 1900, over 6 million. So obviously the cities start increasing population-wise, of course, which occurs. Then you got number 4 there in the list. Of course, rise of various industrialized industries. That's one of the things you start seeing, of course, that occurs next. Textiles being one of the, of course, the big industries that starts first, of course, which really was the first thing that took off. Textiles industries mostly boomed because of population explosions. They had to figure a way to make cloth faster. And so in places like Britain and America, you start seeing that in the especially around the 19th century, more or less. That's one of your first industries that you really start seeing that really takes off. But coal mining took off in England like in the early 1700s. Also, you got the development of iron and steel manufacturing in the 19th century. Petroleum will kind of take off late 19th century as well. Shipbuilding, of course, was big in England. Of course, America as well. Those are industries that become real big, especially like steamships, things like that. They start producing, by the mid to late 1800s and all that. I want to next get into and talk about, of course, the so-called textile industry, which I said was one of the big industries that really took off, especially like with cotton being one of the big things, of course, that's big. And then also you've got, coal as well. Not coal, wool. Yeah, textiles were big with cotton and wool. They had other things like linen cloth, I think, too, is big. And they also had the flax. Yeah, linen was like from the flax plant. Also hemp. Of course, they used hemp to make a lot of things out of too, as well. Now, yeah, they had all these new inventions that came out that were big right here. You got the so-called John Kay had the so-called flying shuttle. He was an Englishman, invented that in 1733. The flying shuttle is important because it was the first major mechanical weaving machine, or they call it a loom. So they called it a loom. And it was the first that really, it cut time in half. It also cut labor too. Like it went from like 2 to 1 person, basically, producing cloth. And from there, they started using these machines in like factories later. It's one of the things that they'll start doing, like you saw in the video. And so the flying shuttle is still used today throughout the world as an invention. So yeah, that one as an invention. Then they have the so-called the so-called spinning jenny, which I know they talked about in the video a lot. There, the spinning jenny was invented by James Hargreaves. He was also Englishman as well. It's named after his wife, Jenny Hargreaves. Anyway, this particular machine was the first multi-spindle spinning frame where it had like a spinning wheel on it. You see right there in the picture, which is true about that. I think he got the idea from looking at those spinning wheels that they use to like make cloth and things like that. And so he kind of came up with the idea to use a wheel. You can see it was pretty fast, up to 6 to 8 times faster than the flying shuttle. There's actually later models where it's like 120 times faster, which is crazy, believe it or not. And so, yeah, you start seeing machines like this being used, which I think that was one of the most influential ones, was the spinning jenny that was invented. Then they had the water frame that came next, and that was invented by Richard Arkwright. And Arkwright was famous for developing the first textile mills in England, beginning in the 1770s. He had this famous textile mill called the Derwent Valley Mills in Derbyshire, England. And that's really where they started using a lot of these machines in factories and all that. And the water frame was a type of loom that, spun cloth, and it was water powered. Which water wheels have been around since going back to ancient medieval times. So a lot of these factories had to be set up near like waters or canals to basically, I guess use turbines or whatever to give it power to spin them. So that's something he invented. And you see on the bottom there, it talks about sabotage. Well, apparently some workers didn't like some of the machines because a lot of the women would work at home spinning cloth. but these factories were putting people out of business that were working at home. And so some people would, I guess, go work there and try to break the machines. And they would take off their wooden shoes called a sabot. And they would basically throw them in the machines to break them. So the word sabotage was invented, of course, from that. So the so-called, water frame, that was another invention. Yeah, here's kind of a picture of some water wheels, which, of course, were used. But that went out of fashion. But later they have like sawmills kind of use that kind of thing, like water wheels and things like that. You still see that later, of course. I won't probably talk about that. There's a man named Samuel Crompton. He invented this thing called the spinning mule. It was another invention in the late 18th century that was also popular. It was kind of a cross between the water frame and the spinning jenny. And I think that model ended up being brought over to America, like a version of it, and it was considered a popular model. But you start getting hybrid versions of different kinds of looms being invented. They have all kinds of versions that were, of course, made, over time. But the one that's the most important one they always talk about is one that's still used today a lot. Everybody uses it now, which is the so-called power loom, which was invented by Edmund Cartwright in 1785. That one's the most powerful and efficient one. It was also the first to use steam power, now electrical power, obviously now. So this is the one that everybody talks about that really is the most important one. Like I said, they're still using it now. Like there's still versions of it that are still used to make cloth. But I think just about every one of these variations we've talked about are kind of probably still around or still being used somewhere. I've seen video of some like in India or some of these other countries in the world still using these kinds of machines, like the older ones even too. Of course, they got the one that they always talk about, but they talked about in the video, which, of course, is the so-called cotton gin. That one, of course, was invented by Eli Whitney, who was actually American, who was from Maine, and was invented in 1793. Eli Whitney was actually this inventor who was known for inventing gun locks, like for guns, which I guess would be important, I guess, in warfare. But he came up with this invention where it could, remove cottonseed mechanically. And so it helped to popularize the cotton industry in America and also worldwide. Because I think if they wouldn't have invented this machine, cotton wouldn't have been as popular of a type of cloth that people would have worn, because it was just so expensive to remove the seeds, which had to be done by hand. But if you know about the cotton industry, like I said in the video, it led to increased slavery, like in the United States and probably South America. And all that. And of course, the United States, they think it was kind of one of the underlying causes of why the American Civil War, of course, broke out. So kind of talking about, some of these different, inventors that kind of, influenced the textile industry, which I guess that one right there may have been one of the last ones. That and the power loom, they were the most famous overall. All right, let me get into next and talk about, of course, the big invention that they always talk about that was really the most important one that you really talk about, which is the steam engine. The steam engine, which was invented in the kind of mid to late 18th century, which came out. Anyway, they say the steam engine is considered to be, by the way, most famous invention that revolutionized the Industrial Revolution. Really did. It's real big because it was like used in other industries afterwards when it was created. And I don't know if you know much about the steam engine, but it was originally used in coal mining, starting in England. Around 1712, there was a man named Thomas Newcomen who invented the first actual real steam engine in that's year 1712. And what they used early steam engines for was to basically remove water from the bottom of coal mines. And a lot of the early steam engines were not very good. They're kind of impractical and they would break down. So this guy named James Watt came along and he invented the steam engine, the Watt steam engine, which I do have a picture of right here. I can show you. Here it is, so-called Watt steam engine. And the early steam engines were pretty, they didn't have a lot of power. I think they had like 10 horsepower, I think, from the beginning. But I think by the 1800s, you can see here, the steam power, some of the engines in the 1800s had 10,000 horsepower over time. And Watt was the one who invented the term horsepower. He came up with that word, and then they later used the term watt, like an electrical wattage, named after him. But so Watt was actually Scottish. He actually worked, I think, at the University of Glasgow, like helped them out, and then he heard about this coal mine that had trouble with this Newcomen engine. So he looked at the Newcomen engine and said, hey, I could fix that and make it better. And so he was able to kind of improve it, and make an invention out of it. And Watt, by the way, became very wealthy because of these engines that you're looking at right there. They say he's one of the first actual inventors to really make a lot of money off his inventions, which I think before people really weren't doing too much with that. Also, I wanted to mention about this other man. So yeah, because of the steam engine, one of the things that happened was they eventually went to using them in other industries or areas, like the so-called steamboat or steamship comes along. That was invented by this man named Robert Fulton, who invented one of the first commercial steamships in the world in the United States. I think they call it the Claremont, and it was called all kinds of names. I do have a little short video that I'll show, of course, on the steamship, the invention of it and all that.
The United States is richly blessed with navigable rivers, especially west of the Appalachians and the great Mississippi watershed. But the water only flows one way. And goods would go to New Orleans, they would build what essentially was a raft and pile the goods on the raft, and then they'd take it down to New Orleans and they'd sell the goods and they'd break up the raft and sell it as lumber. But then getting back was another problem. The idea of putting a steam engine on a ship goes back to very shortly after James Watt developed his steam engine. People immediately said, well, we can do this, we can put this into a boat. But actually coming up with a system that worked took quite a while. I mean, John Fitch, an American inventor, developed this system where the steam engine would move racks of paddles. It was neat to look at, but it wasn't really very practical. And it was Robert Fulton with his partner Robert Livingston who came up with the first practical steamship. It was usually called the Claremont. It was named after Robert Livingston's estate up the Hudson. And Robert Livingston family was a very powerful, rich family in New York at that time, and he got the New York State Legislature to give them a monopoly on steam-powered navigation if he could get a boat that would go from New York to Albany in less than 24 hours. And the New York State Legislature thought, well, that's like, give them a monopoly on traffic to the moon. You're not going to be able to do that. And then, of course, the Claremonts took off in 1807 and chugged its way merrily up the Hudson River and in plenty of time, and so they had this monopoly. They were the only people legally allowed to operate steamships on the waters of New York State. The steamship immediately spread, especially to the Mississippi, and became part of the whole ethos of America. It's hard, you can't think of antebellum America without thinking of the steamships paddling their way up and down the rivers and blowing up rather frequently too, I might add.
I like that, blowing up. Yeah, that's true. But they would blow up, of course, because those steam. I guess the steam engines could be kind of unstable sometimes and all that. So yeah, it's kind of interesting about how that kind of got started. Oh, also another thing I did want to mention, which is interesting about Robert Fulton, he invented one of the first submarines, believe it or not, which you're looking at right there, which is called the Nautilus, invented about 1800. And I think he originally built it to sell it to Napoleon to use it against the British Navy. Yeah, believe it or not. It was like one of the first, I guess, ships or whatever to have like a propeller on it, because you start seeing like in the 1800s ships also using propellers rather than say paddle wheels or whatever. And I think that was a hand crank one or whatever, but they call them submersibles in those days. But that's something that was kind of invented, for that time period. Also, I wanted to mention about the locomotive. That's another thing that was invented, of course. It's very famous, of course, in the early 1800s. So yeah, you start seeing like steam engines being used, of course, in land transportation, like you see right here. And there was a man named Richard Trevithick, you see there, who was a British engineer. He, of course, created the first actual locomotive, which was called Catch Me Who Can, which you could see ran on like iron rails, of course, later steel rails. And a lot of the early ones were not that fast. Like that one was like 6 miles per hour. But as they got faster, people started to compare them to like a horse, because a horse is pretty fast. And so it's made out of iron. And so, they started calling it iron horse, if you know about that. And so what happened later was they believed that because of the locomotives, it led to the rise of railroads, being built throughout England, United States and other countries worldwide. So you got the so-called age of the iron horse that comes in the 1800s. They dub it sometimes, especially in America. I know they call it that. So yeah, because of that, you get this mass transportation systems being, created all throughout pretty much the world. Of course, they had different kinds of locomotives that were built throughout the world. Of course, here's one that was built in the early 1800s, of course, called the so-called rocket, they dub it. And there's a man named George Stephenson I wanted to mention about. Stephenson was believed to be the first actual industrialist that kind of began to build railroads. He built the so-called Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830, which was, by the way, the first railroad to link up two major cities. So that's something he invented, Stephenson. And his son, he had a son too, by the way. I'll mention him later. His name was Robert Stephenson, and Robert Stephenson is the one that actually built the rocket, not his father. He had a company. It was called the Robert Stephenson, I think, Locomotive Company or something like that. They were the first to manufacture locomotives in the thousands. I think they had a monopoly on it for a bunch of years in England, I know. And the rocket supposedly is the big template for other, locomotives that come later in the 1900s, like the platform for it, more or less. Stephenson is also famous for inventing what they call the standard gauge rail system, which is also called a Stephenson gauge. It's where the tracks are basically 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. So that's basically the traditional types of, I think majority, I want to say almost 2/3 of railroads, across the world pretty much use the Stephenson standard gauge. And I think the other one is like the narrow gauge, which I think is usually between like 2 to 4 feet range, little narrower compared to that. So obviously those two men, George Stephenson and his son Robert, had a big influence on, of course, the development of early locomotives, which will be really big in the 1800s, like especially mid to late 1800s in the United States, like over here. Of course, they got this other thing, of course, you got to talk about, which is real important since we're talking about that. You got, Henry Bessemer, who really is very important in really transforming a lot of these industries. Bessemer was this English industrialist that was one of the first to manufacture steel a lot, like and mass produce it. He's one who invented the so-called Bessemer process. And the Bessemer process is where they basically converted pig iron, like molten pig iron, into carbonized steel, which was much stronger and better. The Bessemer process was very important because it really revolutionized, a lot of different industries. Pretty much, anything that was being manufactured, it's definitely influenced that. Construction of anything, whether it be buildings, cars or whatever else they're constructing, tanks, those kind of things. Of course, they got used in warfare, as you know. Of course, bridges, railroads, anything, of course, made out of pretty much eventually steel, that kind of thing. And Bessemer did have a nickname. He was called the Man of Steel. It's true. Before Superman came along, he was the first Superman, I guess. Of course, in America, Henry Bessemer influenced Andrew Carnegie, who was from Scotland originally, who came to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he eventually developed his own steel company, which later became what's later U.S. Steel, which is one of the first major steel corporations you have, of course, first billion-dollar corporation in the world as well. So that's pretty important. Bessemer, I think without him, you wouldn't have been able to build skyscrapers, things like that. Right. Also, let me get into here's by the way a Bessemer converter. So yeah, they would melt this iron in these huge furnaces that you're looking at right here, and then they would pour it out and make whatever stuff out of it. So that's pretty interesting right there. Of course, America used to produce the most steel in the world. I think China now produces like 10 times what we produce, which is amazing how our industries have kind of fallen down. But it's just cheaper to buy it from there compared to us. All right. So, also did want to talk about telecommunications. That's another thing that's also big, too, in the Industrial Revolution. It's like you've got these three big inventions that come out in the 1800s. You got the telegraph, you got the telephone, and you got the wireless radio, just in that order, 1, 2, 3, that you're looking at. Of course, the first they always talk about first is at the right there. You can see Samuel Morse. He was one of several men that helped invent the telegraph, which was actually invented by multiple people. You know about that? I think there was another guy named Charles Wheatstone in England had kind of influenced it a lot as well. And the telegraph was a type of system where they sent electronic messages using like code pulses, so-called Morse code, which of course Morse invented. And in 1832, he sent the first telegraph message, which was a biblical saying, which is, "What hath God wrought?" which was sent May of 1844. And so after that, telegraphs became real popular in the world. And Western Union, by the way, became one of the first corporations, by the way, in the world that later monopolized it. I think they just send money now, I guess, or whatever. Or I guess they send messages too, still by email, I guess. I don't know, whatever they do. But people don't use telegraphs much anymore, I guess. Not too much. But then they got wireless telegraph, which you see there. Guglielmo Marconi was an Italian American. He came from Italy. And Marconi in the 1890s helped popularize basically wireless telegraph, which is also called radio as well. They start figuring out they could send radio waves and basically send messages instead. He had his own company. I'll put it on the screen, but it was called the Marconi Wireless Company, which was the first to monopolize wireless telegraph where you could send messages, kind of like the wireless version of Western Union. And if you sent a message from them, it was called a Marconigram, believe it or not. Then you've got, of course, Alexander Graham Bell, who, of course, they always talk about. He was one of the inventors that helped develop the telephone. It is kind of controversial. Some people think he didn't invent it. There's another guy, but he got to the patent office first, apparently, and they gave him credit for it. And he was originally from Canada. Actually, he's from England. He was in Canada, and he came to America. And in what is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that's where he helped develop the telephone, which was in 1876. And he basically, within so many years after that, began to monopolize it. Which was the so-called Bell Telephone Company, which was later broken up, by the way, if you know about that. I don't know if you heard about the first telephone conversation that ever took place, which is true, which was in 1876. And can you believe it? At one point, they only had two telephones. He and his assistant had one, who was Dr. I think it's Watson, I think his name was. And anyway, Bell was in the lab, and apparently what happened was he spilled some acid on himself. And so he got on the phone to talk to Dr. Watson, and he said, "Mr. Watson, come here. I hurt myself," or something like that. And so he came in there to help him. And that was the first conversation ever on the phone, basically. So now, telephones are, big today. You got cell phones now, and, you can even get email and send messages and internet. And so it's kind of come a long way since, he's doing that there. And believe it or not, he developed telephones because he wanted to develop this device to help out deaf children so they could hear. And he realized it could be used for, of course, telecommunications. All right. Also, I did want to mention also about Thomas Edison. Yeah, let me talk about him. He, of course, was a very famous inventor during the Industrial Revolution, too, like especially the second one that they had. And he was a very famous American inventor who invented just hundreds of different inventions. Looks like over 1,300 patents at one point, which, by the way, revolutionized the way people live. Today. And he had this famous workshop he had in New Jersey, Menlo Park. Yeah, city of Menlo Park. And anyway, they would make hundreds of these inventions. And of course, people would often say, that his inventions were like, they got to be magic. They got to be some kind of wizardry going on there. And so people called him the Wizard of Menlo Park. But what Edison often said about his inventions is that they were very hard work. I think he once said that that a lot of his inventions were 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration, because it was so difficult to make. Or he said sometimes, I didn't invent a certain invention, I just invented how not to invent it, because it was just like they used so many different ways to make it, it didn't work until they finally figured it out. So it's kind of the way it is. And of course, the three big inventions I could give you that were the most famous: the light bulb, the incandescent light bulb, is his most famous invention. The electrical light and all that is really the thing he's most famous for, and all that. Also, the phonograph as well, of course, was something he helped first invent as well. In fact, Edison actually recorded the first song in history, which is "Mary Had a Little Lamb," which with him singing it, by the way. Then, of course, the movie projector was another big invention that Edison created, which helped spawn, Hollywood and all that. And I think he made the first movie, which was The Great Train Robbery, which was made in the early 1900s as well. So Edison had all kinds of inventions. He also had the first electric power company, by the way, I think it was in New York, and he electrified cities like New York City. So New York City was the first to have like a lot of light. And then also Edison was important in developing GE, General Electric, which is, of course, around today still. So he had a lot of influence. I think I guess out of all the different American inventors, he probably had the most influence overall. All right. Also, I did also want to talk about other inventors that were big as well. Also, I did want to talk about the airplane. That's something else, of course, you probably heard about. It kind of came out at the end of the Industrial Revolution, like the second one anyway. And yeah, the airplane was something that they started kind of getting into in the late 1800s because of the popularity of gliders. Everybody started seeing people kind of experiment with gliders, and they started putting engines like propellers on them and all that. And so, yeah, the airplane's important because it helps to revolutionize transportation, commercial-wise, military-wise, especially in war later. World War I, is the first war. They start using airplanes for different things. And, of course, the Wright brothers, who you see there, of course, Orville and Wilbur Wright, they were the first to really fly the first practical airplane in 1903. And it's really weird about the Wright brothers. They actually were bicycle mechanics who owned a bike shop in Ohio, and they heard about gliders. They got into that. And so they started to design and build these airplanes. And so they built the first airplane that was called the Wright Flyer, of course, which they had different versions of it, I think, over time, because some of them crashed. And then in 1903, they flew the first one, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on the east coast of the Carolinas. And they picked that area because it's like real windy and all that. And so after that, airplanes, took off in America. And like you have like the Lockheed brothers, I think, that came later that started building some of the first commercial airplanes that you have that were especially used like in World War I and all that. All right. So anyway, so you got that. And then one more thing I did want to talk about, which is also big too, is the automobile. The automobile was something, that also revolutionized transportation, which they invented in Germany. Mercedes-Benz, was one of the first companies that really, corporation, I guess now, that started building automobiles. But automobiles weren't really mass produced a lot until the 1900s. They always kind of give Henry Ford kind of credit for kind of doing that. He actually mass produced some of the first automobiles with the Model T. I think he first built in 1908. And then by World War I, he was mass producing like millions of them. And I think by the time, I think by 1927, he had built something like 27 million of them. It's like almost a million a year. And to build these cars, they had to have assembly lines where they could just build each part of the car down the line. And you'd have a worker that would build just a part of the car. You'd have a certain job where you put the wheel on or whatever. And they say his workers were paid pretty good. Like I forgot what it was, the amount they were paid. But it was some of the best paid workers, I think, at that time. It was like $5 a day or something they were getting paid or something like that. And so, yeah, the Ford Motor Company, which is still around, in Detroit, Michigan, would influence a lot of the automobile industry, of course, in the United States. And yeah, automobiles are, revolutionized transportation because you could pretty much go anywhere, as long as you got roads. So you don't have to be on a timetable. You don't have to worry about getting on, like on a train or something else like that, what time, whatever it is. And that's one of the great things about, automobiles. They just didn't have enough roads at the time, but eventually they're going to start building roads, more or less in the 20th century. All right, I'm going to shift gears now, and I'm going to kind of move on. I'm going to talk about next, just for a few minutes, I'll kind of get into the rise of socialism, because that's another thing that really kind of takes off, of course, in the, really in the 1800s. You got the rise of socialism that takes off, which is a lot of things that kind of happen, in the world, mostly in Europe where it starts. And then, of course, the ideas of socialism kind of takes off. But before I get to that, I did want to talk about a few things about, socialism. Yeah, the only thing about the Industrial Revolution was the wages, the working conditions, like they talked about in that first video at the beginning of this lecture, was that, yeah, it wasn't exactly great conditions. A lot of the workers were getting paid not much money, a lot of hard work. The conditions were awful. You saw child labor where you got kids like 5, 6 working in mills and coal mines and things like that. So that's something that that's one of the negative sides of, the Industrial Revolution. They always talk about no health insurance, no workers' comp. You see there, if you got hurt on the job, they just replace you. So you get somebody else come in, take your job. Oh, well, too bad, that kind of thing. So there's nothing like that anymore until later. So there's no unions either. There's no unions yet, at least not until probably after the American Civil War, start seeing some. So what happened was lack of reforms led to the so-called rise of socialism, which was this idea of a new kind of political, economic, social system, which was supposed to make the economy more equal, like among the people, among the workers, and all that. And one thing that's different about socialism was that they advocated for basically control of the economy by either the people or by, obviously, you can see centralized government planning. That's one thing about it. And there's all kinds of versions of socialism. Like, how do you define socialism? It's kind of hard to define. If you look up the word or even look up Marxism, it's hard to define. There's all kinds of versions of it, of course, that exist. But the idea was to, obviously, socialism was an idea for giving more equality to the workers, which were not at that time, because most of it, everything was, in control by the actual, industries. They had all the power, and everything. They could just fire you at will, if they wanted to just bring somebody else in, of course, to replace you. You're like a cog in a machine. Still like that kind of today, sometimes with jobs. But Now, I'll talk about the background of socialism. Socialism actually starts in France. The first socialists were actually called utopian socialists, which were mostly like in England, France, also in the United States. And these were kinds of peoples that wanted to live together in equal communities. Like we're mostly like a farming type commune, or people call it usually a cooperative, I think was the actual term they used for it. And so utopian socialism was what they called cooperative socialism. And one thing about it was the utopian socialists, they rejected the whole class struggle, which, is something that is big in Marxism. They didn't believe in that idea. They thought everybody was equal, no matter who they are, male, female, whatever. And some of the early types of utopian socialists were mostly French and British. A lot of them were. Henry Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier were in France, and I think George Ripley and Robert Owen, I think, were mostly British or whatever. So there's some of the first ones that really kind of come up with these kind of ideas that they pushed. And a lot of them would create these utopian societies. The term utopia supposedly came from a book by Sir Thomas More. It was called Utopia, which was this idea of a perfect society, which is kind of what they were kind of trying to do. Kind of like trying to live like the Amish, basically, more or less. And so you had all these different like utopian little communities that kind of spawned everywhere. Like those are some that were in America that were big. New Harmony, Brook Farm. One that's probably the most famous, which was in New York, was Oneida Society, which for years was around. But if you know about it, it went defunct. It didn't work out. And so they started making silverware. Yeah, believe it or not. I think New Harmony was in, I want to say Indiana, I believe it was. But they had these all over the place. They had them in like America, England, France, and stuff like that. But what happened over time was like the so-called Marxists would come in later. And they would kind of see the utopian socialists as being like dreamers, I think is what the Marxists kind of called them, that couldn't be possible, whatever. They thought socialism should be more scientific, being put into it, where you did more of a study of like economics, history, sociology, things like that, in the form of philosophy. It was all made popular by, of course, this man named Karl Marx, who I think everybody's heard of. Marx is the one that's pretty much the father of what we now call, Marxism, or really was modern socialism later. Oh, he's also the father of sociology. I don't know if you know about they're taking a sociology class or whatever. He's considered the father of it as well. And he's a German philosopher that lived in the 1800s, 1818 to 1883. He's famous for a bunch of books that he wrote that's well known. The Communist Manifesto, which is really a pamphlet, which he produced in, I think, 1848. And then Das Kapital, he wrote a little later. Of course, that's also famous. You see there. Both those were very critical towards capitalism. He, of course, was obviously an anti-capitalist who was a socialist. Marx, of course, believed heavily in the class struggle between the different social classes. And he believed that the capitalist system that had been created after the feudalism declined in Europe, he believed that it would eventually collapse over time. And he believed that the reason why is because of an internal struggle that would occur between the different classes that were in it, so-called class struggle. And anyway, he says that there's mostly two main classes that formed out of the whole, capitalism thing after feudalism declined. You've got these two classes. You got the so-called bourgeoisie, which he called the so-called capitalists. And these are all the ones that control the means of production. They own the factories and the businesses, and they hire people to work for their businesses. So these are all the people. And they say these people were the people that came out of the upper middle class, is what it is. And they replaced the nobility after feudalism declined and all that, and Europe modernized. And versus the so-called proletariat, which is the working class. And so you got those the wage earners that are making money working for the capitalist bourgeoisie. So those are the two systems. There's different class systems you've got. What Marx believes is that over time, he thought that what would occur was that there would be this big wealth gap that would form between the two classes, also inequities between the two classes. And he thinks that's what's going to happen over time, is that there'll be a socialist type revolution, or he calls it a workers' revolution, where they'll overthrow capitalism is what will happen. And then what will happen is his theories, of course, originally was that what would occur was that it would lead to what they call revolutionary socialism, would create a stateless, classless, moneyless society. So you wouldn't have a state, you wouldn't have any classes, everybody's equal, I guess. There's no money as well. Sounds like Star Trek or something like that. It sounds like Star Trek. When you think about it, if you've ever watched Star Trek, it's probably the closest thing I could think of to it. And but that never happened. Like if you know the theories of Marx, it never really happened like he wanted, more or less. And so what happens later, you get these hybrid versions of socialism that come later, that are versions of it. They're not quite like that, like it's supposed to be. And there's different versions, of course, of socialism that become popular. One we'll talk about later, which, is big in the 1900s, like 20th century, will be what they call Marxism-Leninism. That's one that everybody dreads, hates, and of course, which started in Russia, which was the so-called Soviet Union. And that was based off of a totalitarian version of socialism, based off of theories of Karl Marx, but also Vladimir Lenin. He was a Bolshevik socialist in Russia. And yeah, it's more totalitarian, basically what it is. And communism is like a deal where the whole state is socialist, and it's like a one-party state. So there's no other political parties in it. Everything's socialist. There's not really supposed to be any capitalism either as well. Although obviously that kind of evolves differently over time, with communism today that you've got now. You've also got what they call Maoism, which was kind of a version of Marxism-Leninism that became popular in Communist China, or the so-called People's Republic of China, which you can see was developed by Mao Zedong in the mid-20th century. What was that? Well, Maoism is a little different from Marxism-Lenin. It's kind of similar, but it involved the peasants. It's like kind of like a form of communism where the peasants revolted instead of the working class. And that's the difference between the two, I think, that kind of developed. But communism today is, something that would spread elsewhere. So yes, Soviet Union, of course, you had it, the first, then China, then it spread to North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba. Those are all the main countries, I guess, worldwide that would basically have some form of communism. But a lot of these countries today, as you know, have had to embrace, market capitalism. You see in China, they're doing that. Vietnam, they're doing that, and so on. I guess Cuba eventually. North Korea is kind of obviously not behind on that. You can see, but that's something that, also, that's needed. They pretty much need capitalism. And then you got what they call social democracy. You got that too. You got the democratic socialism, which is kind of the political aspect of that. And that rejects the communist version of socialism. They were kind of against that radical version. It's more of a moderate form of socialism, which uses like peaceful means to convert a state, from pure capitalism to like socialism. And you can see there, it's mostly an economic, political, social system that was developed to make, obviously, economics more fair among the people. It's still capitalism. They're still using mostly capitalism, but the government's more socialist. They've got a lot of, social programs like universal health care, things like that, that they have as well. And in Europe, that kind of socialism is very popular today. Like in a lot of the Scandinavian countries, you got the Nordic model, like in Denmark and Sweden, Finland, and other countries, that's based off of that idea. Of course, in countries like Britain, US, I guess, United States, we're more like welfare capitalism, I think, is what we've got. We're more of a capitalist state with some, socialism a little bit, like Social Security and all that we've got today. But we're more capitalist, than socialist, obviously. Although Bernie Sanders, I think, wants to change it, and all that, I guess. But basically, yeah, those are still the two rival types of economic systems that people kind of, talk about today. Should we have capitalism or should we have socialism, more or less? I think it was Winston Churchill that once said that capitalism is really there's no system that works the best, but it's the best one out of all of them. What is, and Margaret Thatcher used to say something like, she said that the socialists, they always run out of other people's money. One of the things that she said about socialism, so some people don't like it. They think they're kind of negative about it today, but anyway, so that's it for today, lecture-wise, of course. Now, I am going to be moving on, of course, later, after the spring break. I'm going to, of course, mostly be moving to the 20th century. I think at first I will talk about the rise of nationalism in Europe, because that's one of the major causes of World War I. So I'll kind of talk about that. And then I'll kind of talk about the causes of World War I as well. So we'll be moving into that direction, closer to the 20th century. But before I go, don't forget, you do have some assignments, of course, that are still up, which I think the main thing looks like I've got that Waterloo course video quiz, to work on. Of course, get that done as well. And then don't forget about the second exam. That's the big thing. I'll kind of keep that up a long time, though, that assignment for you, get that out the way. And so that's it for today. So I hope y'all have a great spring break come up. For y'all, we don't have classes Friday, and then, of course, next week as well. So I think we go back to school. Looks like Monday, April 12th. So y'all take care. Have a great spring break and all that. And of course, I will see y'all later.